So I've been a professional photographer for about 2 years now, and one of the most common questions I get asked all the time is, I'm a beginner and I'm looking to get into photography. What camera should I buy? Now, because this topic is quite complex and going through every single individual scenario is quite hard, I want to give you the general resources to help you pick your camera. Before we get started, I want to lay out a couple things. First of all, this video is not going to narrow down the exact camera for you. You're going to have to find that based on the features that you want, the price of the camera, and your budget. The next thing is this video is broken into two parts. First of all, we're going to have a discussion about whether you actually need a camera or not, which is super important. Don't skip it. And the second half, which is going to go over general gear and what you should look for when you're narrowing down a camera. Now that we have that out of the way, let's get to the video. Now, before you even start looking at cameras, what I want you to do is ask yourself, why do you want a camera and whether or not you actually need it? And a lot of you guys are probably thinking, that's a really stupid question. I want to buy a camera so I can get better image quality, and obviously by buying a camera, that's going to allow me to get better image quality. Now that's a fine statement, but what if I told you photos that come straight out of a camera are not going to be any better than your smartphone? Now, before you click off, hear me out. If you decide to buy a new camera and you just chuck it in the full auto mode, you don't spend the time to learn the manual settings, and you don't spend the time to learn editing, then what you're going to find is that the phone is going to come up with better results than the camera. That being said, the digital camera has a much higher ceiling of image quality and the potential of making better images than your phone. But to unlock that potential, you need to spend hours and hours learning the manual settings and also learning the editing software required to take better photos. Now, if you've gone through that and you've still decided that you want to spend the time and effort to learn how to use a camera, I'm going to throw one more hurdle at you, and that is the hidden costs that's involved with photography. Now, a lot of people who start photography think that they only need to buy a camera body, a lens, maybe a tripod, but there's actually a lot of hidden costs that come with starting photography. Now, the first one is storage. We're going to get back to this guy, but your camera takes memory cards. Usually it's an SD or CF Express, and these can be quite expensive. A lot of the higher end SD cards go up to $500, and a lot of the higher end CF Express cards can go up to $2,000. On average, you'll probably find an SD card for about $100 and a CF Express for about $200, $300, maybe $500. So you have to keep that in mind when you're buying a camera. So we're going to get back to this guy. This is half optional, but I would highly recommend you get a SSD to store your photos long term, as well as to edit off of. Just because the SD card and the CF Express tend to fail a lot more, they tend to corrupt, and they also just don't have as much storage for the price. And so I highly recommend getting an SSD. The next hidden cost you should worry about are subscriptions. You might consider using cloud storage just because they have an easier access to your photos than, say, the SSD. And you also have subscriptions on your editing software like Adobe. I use the Adobe photography plan, which consists of Lightroom, Lightroom Classic, and Photoshop. Now, I know there are free alternatives out there, but nothing really compares to the UI and the features that come with the Adobe Lightroom and Photoshop subscription. In Australia, the minimum photography package plan is $14.29, and that's paid monthly, but on an annual plan. So I'm pretty sure there's going to be fees that are involved with canceling with Adobe, which a little bit scummy, but now that's just the bare minimum costs. Keep in mind, you're probably going to be spending money on stuff like lights, cleaning equipment, SD card readers. There's a lot of other discretionary things that is a nice to have that you might spend money on. So just keep that in mind before you move on. Now, that's pretty much all I wanted to say for the first half of the video. If you've thought this through and you've decided that you still want to go with a camera, you can continue watching and I'll help you narrow down your options. If you're in the camp of, I don't want to spend the money and the time, then the best thing I can recommend is upgrading your smartphone. That's pretty much the main upgrade you would do to get instant better image quality without much additional effort. Okay, so now that we have part one out of the way, we can finally get into the part two, which is going to be narrowing down your camera choices. Now, when it comes to narrowing down your camera choices, one of the first things you're going to be looking at is the difference between a DSLR and mirrorless. To make this comparison as easy to digest as possible and make it as fair as possible, I'm going to set a couple of parameters. The first parameter I'm putting in place is any DSLRs I'm talking about will be built in the last 10 to 12 years, so 2010 to current day. Now there's 3 reasons why I'm putting that parameter there. First of all, I want to make sure you're consistently beating out your phone. Not to say that a DSLR from before that time can't beat out your phone, but as a general rule, I think it's pretty safe to say DSLRs made within the last 10, 12 years should be able to consistently beat your smartphone when it comes to editing and the features that come with it. The second reason why I've put that parameter there is to make sure there's a level playing field, at least with image quality, between a DSLR and mirrorless. DSLR technology has come a long way since 1999, so it's really not that fair to put really old tech DSLR to the new mirrorless cameras. The third reason I put that parameter there is to make sure that you still have access to a lot of the equipment. With some of the really old gear, it can be hard to find and source batteries, compact flash, etc. They're just obsolete equipment that people don't use. And so I want to make sure that what's around is still in the market or at least easily accessible. Now for the second parameter, I'm going to be comparing similar tier DSLRs and mirrorless. Now what I mean by that is if I'm comparing something like a D750 to something in the new mirrorless line, I would be comparing that to something like a Z6 III. Now that we have all of that out of the way, what are the differences? Well, generally speaking, mirrorless cameras tend to be quicker in autofocus, burst rates. They're pretty much easier to use because you can see the exposure change right in front of your eyes, and they generally tend to have better video features and are better suited towards video. And again, I have to stress this enough, but keep in mind those parameters because a higher tier DSLR might actually outperform a lower end mirrorless when it comes to those specs. But as a general rule, that's usually how it goes. So you might be asking, if mirrorless is so much better in these respects, then why even go for a DSLR? The image quality that comes out of a DSLR is not going to be that different to a modern mirrorless camera. So if you're only concerned about image quality and you're not worried about video, you don't want speed, all of that, then a DSLR might be the better option. And the value difference becomes incredibly obvious when you look at something like a Nikon D5, which was an old flagship DSLR, to a Z6 III, which is a mid-level camera. The D5 has probably the ultimate image quality, it has a pro body, and the lens selection is cheaper for the same equivalent lens. That's pretty good if you ask me, compared to a mirrorless. So I've told you the differences between the two, but which one is right for you? Now that's completely up to you, but generally speaking, if you're only focused on stills, you're not too worried about the shooting speed and the burst rate, which is most people, then a DSLR is going to be more than enough. If you value video, ease of learning, and future upgradability, then mirrorless is probably the way to go because you'll be able to upgrade to the newest, latest, and greatest stuff. Now that's not to say you can't upgrade from DSLRs to mirrorless. A lot of mirrorless cameras have adapters that can take old lenses. But generally speaking, you're going to cop a loss because you're probably going to want to switch to the native lenses for mirrorless cameras. Okay, so you know the differences between mirrorless and DSLRs now, and that's going to help you narrow down your options. But I want to get through sort of the process of picking your actual camera. Now, the first thing you need to find is your budget. How much are you willing to spend on your camera? Once you've figured out how much you're willing to spend, what I want you to do is allocate half at least, 3/4 is better, but at least half into the lens you're going to buy. And the other half or other quarter into the camera body. And this is because the lens is going to be much more important in determining how your image looks than the actual camera that you have. And with lenses, you generally want to be going for an f4 fixed aperture at the very least, and anything lower is usually better. The next thing you need to do after making that budget is putting a list of cameras that fit within that price range and a couple that are a little bit higher than you're comfortable with. What that list probably looks like to you is a higher tier of DSLR to a lower tier of a mirrorless camera. And that's going to be completely normal. That's just the state of how technology is now. The next thing I'm going to tell you is quite controversial, and so I'm going to give you both sides of the argument. I personally think most beginners should go with a generalist camera with a general lens. And I say that because I think most beginners don't really know what they want to shoot. And even if they do know what they want to shoot, a lot of the times they end up branching out to different genres. The other school of thought is you should go for a camera that specializes in your type of photography. If you're a wildlife shooter, you would go for something that's high megapixel, fast burst rate, and the lens that you choose would be a long lens. But for those who aren't sure, the middle ground would be to buy a camera body that sort of leans towards the specs that you need and buying two separate lenses. Keep in mind, by going for this route, you're probably going to be either overspending on your budget or reducing the quality of the equipment you have. Okay, so that's probably covered pretty much everything you need to narrow down your camera choices, but I just want to leave you with one more tip, and that is heavily consider the secondhand market. Now, as nice as it is to buy a completely new camera, getting a used camera is probably the better value for the money. And I say that because camera equipment tends to depreciate very quickly. And because of the depreciation, you're probably gonna be able to find some really good deals on cameras with a lot of life left in them. Believe it or not, most of my camera equipment is actually bought secondhand. And I cannot tell you how many thousands of dollars I've saved on equipment. So that pretty much summarizes this video. If you found a camera, make sure you list it down below and tell me why you got it. And if you're a professional photographer and you have some more tips about buying cameras in general, leave them down in the comments below. If you'd like to see more content like this in the future, make sure to like and subscribe. And that's about it. Thank you.